If you're in the audience, your cameras and mics are off by default, but you can interact with us. You can reach our team and pose questions for speakers by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We also have simultaneous interpretation today for this session. You can choose your language in the bottom left part of your screen. And with that, I'll also remind our speakers to do what I cannot do and remember to speak slowly so that our interpreters can keep up. On that note, I'm very pleased to introduce our last session of the day. We thought it would be interesting to bring together a bunch of workplace investigators and just kind of let them talk. How often do you get to hear the inside scoop about what goes on in harassment investigations, especially without going through one yourself? What can we learn from these people who spend their whole lives working, deep in the belly of some of our toughest workplace conflicts? Let's see. So joining us today are Nicole Smith, Jody Carr, and Barry McKnight. Barry McKnight has been investigating workplace misconduct cases since 2013. Prior to that, he completed a 30-year career in policing, retiring as the chief of police with the Fredericton Police Force. Jody Carr is a former member of the Legislative Assembly of New Brunswick and now a lawyer and a practicing workplace investigator. And Nicole Smith needs no introduction for most of this audience, but we'll give her one anyway. Nicole was born and raised in New Brunswick, but has also lived or worked in the Philippines, Ottawa, Toronto, Victoria, and the Northwest Territories. Nicole is passionate about conflict management and has worked in the field for over 14 years. She is a qualified mediator with the Alternative Dispute Resolution Institute of Canada and has a master's degree in dispute resolution. Through her company, Nicole Smith Conflict Management, Nicole provides positive, compassionate conflict management services across New Brunswick. When she's not working, Nicole likes to volunteer, bike the trails around Fredericton, and hang out with her cat, Ollie, which sounds like a good way to spend your time. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel. As a reminder to the audience, you don't have to wait for the end. You can drop your questions in Q&A at any time, and we'll be keeping an eye on them. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And I'm hoping Ollie doesn't make an appearance at this session, but he's want to get involved. So if he does, I apologize. And I want to thank you, Barry and Jody, for joining me today for this discussion. I really appreciate you giving us your time. So as a bit of an introduction to those who are participating, when a harassment complaint is filed in New Brunswick, an employer can either choose to investigate it themselves as an internal investigation, or they can hire an external investigator. And when they do that, there's a small number of people in New Brunswick, which sort of fluctuates between about 6 and 12 people in New Brunswick, professionals in New Brunswick, who do workplace investigations on a regular basis. We are consultants who specialize in workplace conflict management. Some of us focus on investigations. Some of us, like myself, provide a broader range of services like mediations and trainings, as well as investigations. And we come from backgrounds of policing and law and human resources and human rights and unions. And we all come to this field because we care about conflict management. We're excited about conflict management. And even though we all work alone, because it's such a small group of professionals in New Brunswick that do this very specialized kind of work, we often interact, we often connect with each other to support each other as colleagues, even though we're all technically independent and on our own, because we're all doing workplace harassment investigations, workplace misconduct investigations all the time. And so Jody, Barry, and I are here today, as Michelle said, to talk about our work in workplace as workplace investigators and to answer some of your questions about workplace investigations. So I think I'll get started by asking, one question that came up as we were preparing for this panel was, how do you picture yourself in your role as an investigator? What does it mean to be an investigator? What does your work as an investigator look like? So I'd love to put that question to Barry and to Jody.
I'm very shy, Barry, so maybe you could go first. Uh, Thanks. That's yeah, good question. And so, um, well, first of all, I mean, I see myself as arm's length from the organization, and so that outside set of eyes who can come in and have a fresh look at things, which I think agencies are often looking for. Whether for a variety of reasons, whether their internal folks maybe don't have the skill set or are too close to the circumstances surrounding the particular complaint. So an outside person, arm's length, independent, but I also, you know, I also see myself as independent, but you have to be collaborative as well. You can't be pushing away and refusing to communicate with the agency and not be alive to what their concerns are, right? Because we work for large organizations and very small private sector organizations sometimes. In the nonprofit sector, for example, they need input on how this can be done appropriately and being sensitive to all of the other pressures that they have. So being arm's length, independent but collaborative, and one of the major things that I continuously hear about from folks is that as an investigator, I need to be able to make a decision. And sometimes I know that can be a bit of a challenge for folks because these cases are serious. And when you're dealing with balance of probabilities, you know, sort of that 50-50, if it's 51-49, you're deciding in that direction, right? And so, and as we probably all know, if you're coming out thinking it's 50-50, you're not working hard enough. You need to do more work because let's be realistic, it's just never 50-50, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I like that start to our conversation. Thank you, Nicole and to Please for the invitation, as well as for giving us a chance to actually have an opportunity to talk amongst ourselves, which very rarely happens, if ever. So it's a great chance to learn from each other. We are not a regulated profession, if you want to call it that, for workplace investigation in New Brunswick. And so you know, so that has to it even more importance for the agency, the employer, to have a collaborative um, approach with the investigator. And that's one of the roles I see. I think I see usually is to use the opportunity to educate, I guess, all of the parties to an investigation as we go through the process with the complainant and the respondent and any witnesses. They're often asking, what should I expect? How's this process going to unfold? What's the purpose of the process? But also to often educate or discuss with the employer what the role is and what our expectations will be. And I, like Barry, feel that the expectation is that the employer has hired us to make a determination. Sorry about that.
You're just too busy, Jody. You're just too in
phone calls
demand.
already going from from the participants. Thanks for calling. 447 car. Just joking, but not joking. But is to make a decision. So you're trained as part of my training with the HRPA investigation certificate is to make a determination. And if there's two versions of a story that are completely opposed, then there's a process to follow as part of a credibility assessment to get to your 51-49 and to determine what's more likely to have happened. So I see that as a kind of an educator, as a collaborative, as Barry said, as an intermediary, and also being somewhat gentle to allow for potentially an opportunity for future resolution or future work collaboration, depending on the seriousness of the allegations. I think my role is not to contribute to the drama and not to contribute to the chaos, and to try to be as focused as possible in terms of the investigation, do no more damage than already has been done if possible, and to see that hopefully this would be a beginning of a healing process, really. So that's a few insights, maybe, Nicole.
Yeah, I want to clarify for participants a couple of things or kind of draw together a couple of things that both Barry and Jody have said. When you're asked to go in as an investigator, I'm someone who came to this work through training as a mediator, through an academic path, and um, in a path that led me through informal conflict management, which was really more about restoration than it was about decision making. But harassment investigations need to happen. They're an important piece of the conflict management toolkit in a workplace, and it's an important role to play. And so that's where I found myself doing this role sometimes as well. And when you are an investigator, you are being asked to decide by the employer what happened, and does what happened constitute harassment, poison work environment, abuse of authority, whatever the terminology is in their policy, as per the definitions in their policy. And so when we talk about being decision makers, it's because essentially we're being asked to say, is the circumstance in which we're presenting you, is the complaint that's being presented to you a real situation of harassment? And if it is, please let us know. And the employer is asking us to make that determination. And then the employer gets to decide, do they agree with us or do they not agree with us? They get to be the final decision maker, but we are being asked to make a determination, which is a very different hat than when you're a mediator or a coach, when your job is to support people through a more informal, sort of emotional based process. And so when I think of myself as an investigator, like Jody, I often start from a place of education immediately with the client, because we're dealing with policies, we're dealing with work safe regulations that we, as people in this field, deal with every day, but that most people don't deal with every day. They barely deal with them once a year if they're an employer, hopefully. And so I feel like a lot of our role at the very beginning is even just to educate on what those steps are, what those processes are, what the rules are, and then to help make sure everyone feels at least a sense of understanding of that process as we go along. When it comes to how I feel like what my job is, of course, I'm neutral, I'm impartial, I'm the decision maker. My goal and how I see myself is as the person whose job it is to guard the process. The process is there to get an outcome. I need to make sure that the process is being done in a way that is procedurally fair, that supports everyone's rights in the process, that the process, though I want to collaborate with the client and I want to help support the parties, the process needs to be followed procedurally. And I'm going to fight for that process if anyone's trying to sort of push in and deviate from it. And that's really how I see myself in this role, as kind of the guardian of the process as I go along. So I want to ask one of the questions that came up as we were discussing this panel that I think is actually really interesting and that I hadn't often thought about in this context is as an investigator, if someone's going to hire an external investigator for their workplace, what are some green flags, or what are the things that you should be looking for in an investigator you're going to hire? How do you have a sense of who's going to be a good investigator coming into your workplace?
Well,
There's so many things. Okay, go Barry.
Sorry.
Go. No.
A couple of things come to mind that, and we touched on actually some other things I think already. You know, I think they should be looking for someone with experience, and I don't mean old. I mean, who, whether they've worked internally in the, you know, my beard's the grayest, so hire the oldest person kind of thing. Somebody with some experience, whether it's inside the organization, working in HR, whatever that may be, some level of experience and training. Somebody who has a proven track record for making decisions. If you have an investigator who's like, you know, most of the time I can't, like we've already said, that would not be a green flag. I think having at least an understanding and awareness of the impact on trauma of people in the workplace who have been subjected to, well, they're complaining they have been subjected to an abusive environment. That's critically important, I think, when it comes to credibility assessment. So I think that's important because trauma, as we know, and people who are in the workplace have lives away from the workplace, of course, as we all know, and sometimes they bring trauma to work. So having at least an awareness about that, I think, is important because that impacts on a lot of other things. Not the least of which is again the issue of credibility assessment. I have had experience in a number of cases where people who the employer sees as difficult to manage for a variety of reasons, whether it is a trauma background or mental illness or whatever the case may be, which traditionally some people would see some of those behaviors as impacting on their credibility, are also highly vulnerable to being people abused in the workplace. So there's an interesting mix that investigators need to be aware of. So a couple of things there.
Barry, how would you say if someone listening to this today is thinking, how are they going to have a sense of, and I know how I think, but how do you think they're going to have a sense of whether or not an investigator is coming from a place where they're at least somewhat trauma informed, where they're trying to bring that context into their work?
Yeah, my head got spinning even as you asked that question. So how would I get that from the
Yeah, I
project?
know from
I,
my perspective, if I'm hiring an investigator, I want to hear them talking about the process in that way, right? The way you're talking about it, being aware of the difficulty of everyone of everyone who's participating, being aware that this person may be a difficult employee and they also may have experienced harassment. That I want an investigator to speak in a way that shows me that they're coming from that place.
yeah, I mean, if I was hiring, I think I'd be doing exactly. I think I'd be talking to them exactly the way that you and I are talking. You
Yeah.
know, trying to tease out opportunities to see how they really feel about this. You know, or outright even just simply asking them what's your experience with trauma, clients who've experienced trauma and that sort of thing. And then if they're responding by looking at you like you've got two heads, then we know that that's, you
Yeah.
know, not something that they're alive to. And so maybe we should look further.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Jody, what would you say are some green flags when people are looking for an investigator?
Well, I think that the investigator should be open to collaborate with the client and the agency. I think, Nicole, you mentioned as well, Barry mentioned collaboration. Nicole, you mentioned, okay, there's collaboration, there's that fine line between being told what to do and you're going to do it this way as an investigator because that's how they want it. But then you still have to meet an ethical obligation, legislation, procedural fairness. So I like to involve the client and the employer in terms of even the witness list and have that discussion and say, I'm open to hear feedback. I kind of invite the feedback. I need to kind of know what have they already done in terms of having conversations with the parties? Have they informed them? What did they inform them of? What is the complaint? And we have to make sure the complaint is clear. What is it that we're trying to base this on? So you have that conversation, and then you'd like to have a point of contact. So if the employer hasn't appointed someone, the investigator should be asking, who's our point of contact that we can. Well, then I like to, around the witness list, is have kind of a discussion around that. And I usually say that, I want their input, same as the input from the respondent and the complainant on who they think I should have as witnesses to interview. But I do make it clear it's their input and that I make the decision based on that input and the relevance. So I think that that's kind of important when you're looking for an investigator is how open are they to have this conversation without compromising our principles. I like to make it clear too that that if we have the complaint and there's new information or other information that comes forward outside of that complaint, that I will not expand the investigation without circling back to the employer. So employers are nervous that this is going to open up into a witch hunt, that it's going to be larger than what they expected, that it's going to cost way more than what they expected. So cost is certainly a discussion that an investigator should be willing to discuss. Obviously, there should be a letter of engagement. But you do want to make sure it's as predictable as possible and it doesn't get, as like I said, more damage and more disruption than what has already been in the workplace. So those are some green flags, I think. And I know I will circle back to the employer and say, okay, I've had the conversation with the complainant. I've had the conversation with the respondent. This is their input on witnesses. They usually provide me input on who the witnesses should be. And I just confirm with them who I'm going to either contact next or get their contact information. And we'll usually have that discussion. And then I guess I make the decision. So that's what I would add into right at the moment. I've got series of other thoughts, obviously, but maybe that will give some flavor in what we're looking for today.
Absolutely. I think, you know, from my perspective, I think what you're talking about having those conversations with the employer, with that client, about what your process looks like, what steps you'll be taking, when you're going to be checking back in with them. You're right. It's something that I often you get to a point in this work where sometimes you forget which pieces are standard knowledge and not, right? And you're right. I think a lot of employers who don't deal with this often get very nervous that it's going to grow. And so having an honest conversation with them about that, being very honest about if something new comes up, I'm bringing it back to you. At no point will my mandate expand beyond what we've already agreed to without your permission. Being very honest about your fees and the reality of that. I think is a really great thing. And an investigator who's willing to have those conversations with you, who doesn't get defensive around those questions. Because I think a lot of those questions come from a place of uncertainty and a place of nervousness on the part of an employer, right? Because any employer, whether they're large or small, I know I can't remember which one of you mentioned working with nonprofits. I think, you know I get pulled into nonprofits too. These are places where a board is made up of just good, kind-hearted people in a community, and suddenly they're dealing with this, HR sort of nightmare they don't quite know what to do with. So being able to have those conversations, being willing to answer all those questions, I think is a big green flag. I actually want to move to a question we've had in the chat that is more about and we have a great comment here. Investigators can provide to clients that they have had investigation training, that they understand natural justice, absolutely, that they understand they can do comprehensive analysis, only relevant information will be investigated. Do they fully understand the policy and the legal definitions of what constitutes harassment? I think that's really important. If they're going to be able to read your policy and understand it, it's going to be a good sign to you that they know what they're talking about. We have a question here from an audience member that's more about trends, I think, in what we're seeing. Are you noticing an uptick in racism, discrimination, LGBTQ plus phobia investigations in New Brunswick? Specifically, investigations where it's gone unchecked and uncorrected by the employer. Barry or Jody, do you want to jump in on that one?
I would say that and this is my sense. I'm not tracking that data in my own files, but in my head, sort of over the last 10 years, 120 investigations. But I would say the last 5 years, it's been more common that there would, whether this was the initial impact or the initial complaint had a discriminatory bent to it, that does come out as a factor in the workplace sometimes, and more so in the last 5 years than in the 5 or 7 years previous to that. So and I've seen that also in environments where there was hypersexualized language, and then also racially insensitive language and all kinds of discriminatory things that are just accepted. in some cases, in particular, organizations who are accepting of there is an acceptance in some organizations where there is more manual labor, so people in the trades, for example. That's just the way that the trades are. There's rough language in the workplace and that kind of thing. So anyway, more of that in the last 5 to 7 years than prior to that, in my recollection, my own data.
And I think too, probably we're seeing more complaints in general because the issues are the openness to complain, I guess the encouragement to be able to complain, events like Respectful Workplace, bringing the awareness that it's okay, the rights and the legislation in the occupational health and safety legislation, human rights legislation. But I wonder too if our ability as humans to communicate or to resolve conflict early, to have training in type of workplace communication, resolution, conflict, just general conflict. It can be minor conflict that, if unresolved, escalates to more serious issues and an actual complaint. So by and large, a lot of times, a lot of bad things, they can be prevented. And just like other workplace injuries, workplace conflict can be prevented with clear policy, with clear opportunities to negotiate, to discuss, and to have probably leadership ability to resolve issues when they get brought forward. And if they're not brought forward, a leader can dig down under and find out that there is something going on. That's a hard $1 million question that's happening across society and across our places of work. But what often seems to happen is these issues get avoided. We avoid them, and then it flows over or boils over to a crisis point, and then we have to try to come in and say, okay, something happened, but why and what? And sometimes it's because the management or someone along the chain let something slide or didn't follow up.
I find in my practice that I'm finding, especially more lately, seeing more complaints around more sexual harassment complaints that involve not what we think of as that sort of people stereotype or sort of 80s version of sexual harassment, where it's, putting conditions on promotions or retaliation for rejecting someone. A lot more of what I'm seeing falls into that, the question around if there's more issues around homophobia, transphobia, 2S LGBTQ plus issues, is that there is a higher prevalence, I think, of complaints coming in now of sexual harassment where people are asking inappropriate things about other people's bodies and about other people's personal lives, sex lives, more people making jokes around other people's sexual orientation, gender expression, sort of lower level or sort of microaggression, misogyny happening in workplaces. I see a lot of that. And that to me is the kind of thing that I think speaks to this, where, because I think that comes out when you're talking about microaggressions in general around things like racism as well, that managers don't realize the role that they can play in putting a stop to those things early. And so if you pull someone aside and say, you might not have thought it was inappropriate to talk to your coworkers about your sexual past, but it was. Or you might have been talking to your summer students about the parties you went to when you were in, you went to when you were in university and all the wild things that you did, but that's making them uncomfortable. Please don't do that again. These things that are going to fall into a category of creating a poison work environment or sexual harassment, or things that are going to be a microaggression that are going to accumulate to a point where they can be becoming harassment. And so I think managers have a really huge role that they can play in addressing those things early, because if someone realizes that that is crossing a line, they will hopefully adjust their own behavior. We have a question
And
here.
you
Oh,
know,
sorry, Jody, go on.
well, just quickly, I mean, it goes to similar or other minority groups, and with diversity, a lot of new Canadians, people coming to the workplace, the labor force expanding, whether it's racism based on culture and religion, whether it's also racism discrimination based on ability, disability, as we have an increased diverse population. There's what we used to think is okay is not okay, and so there's still some people that you're educating around. They'll say, well, I didn't do something specifically or say something specifically, but to understand discrimination, it can be that that unintentional or even that bias that's happening in our actions and our conduct and the decisions we make, even though not directly, they can indirectly adverse be discrimination. So lots of continued learning. Sorry, now
Absolutely.
you
No,
go.
that's
Yeah.
great. It actually feeds right into a question we have from the audience about how can public servants respond to racism when delivering service, trying to increase the likelihood of delivering service without risking receiving a complaint from clients. It says the situations start with either where are you from or loud complaints about not understanding you because of your accent. We want to give the best service, but the situation becomes very stressful and we don't know how to react to diffuse this racist behavior. So someone who may be in a public facing role, we had that really great presentation earlier today from the teachers union and from the nonprofit that focuses on access to supporting democracy and talking about people in public roles that are dealing with harassment, but also people I think in public facing roles deal with a lot of behavior as well. And this question seems to really be around, how does someone handle those racist or microaggressive behaviors coming towards them in their own workplace? How do they address that? And I think my advice to someone who's experiencing that would be that it's about going to your management and saying to your management, as your employee, I need you to help me address this. I need you to support me in this. I need you to protect me from this.
I noticed too, a lot of places of employment, even on while you're waiting on the call, there will be a recorded message that talks about to clients or to customers about harassment, bullying. There's different wording around being kind, and that abusive and such type of comments will not be tolerated and maybe disconnected or discontinued. Barry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, but I think it's exactly in line with what you were saying, Nicole, is that there's an obligation for the organization to train people in those public facing positions to be able to deal with the general public. And I mean, at some point here, we're going to say that some organizations, when it comes to managing the performance of their employees, are failing dramatically in doing that. But I think some areas where they're doing better is the people in those public facing positions, they're getting them de-escalation training, and they should be providing if the customer base involves people who are not first language English or French speakers or whatever the case may be where you're living, then the employer has to be able to deal with that, to give the staff the tools that they need to do their job. And so, the staff need to be comfortable to feed that up to their supervisors and get more than a dismissive, just deal with it. You'll develop the skills, and it is great. And Jody, what you say when those messages are that, first of all, we just start by being kind to the people that we're serving, and that goes a long way, of course, in preventing complaints, because you're just providing good service. But the organizations need to arm their staff with the skills they need to do their job, whatever that takes, whatever that looks like.
I think sometimes it's tough as an investigator. We want to be, I think the three of us I have spoken to wanting to be people who, to a certain degree, are educating the clientele and the parties that come before us in these processes, but we are coming in reactionary, even when I'm being brought in for something like a mediation. So I'm coming in at a more informal level than an investigation. There's a something that's sort of metaphorically exploded, and you are being brought in as to react. And so it's we're not always at that upfront place where we can, people aren't calling us in, unfortunately, to help for some of the preventative stuff, which I think we all wish we could be more involved in.
Yeah, I'm asking, for example, I'm asking when there's a dynamic where a supervisor perhaps is a respondent in a complaint that on its face appears to be the supervisor not being able to manage the performance of the employee. I'm always, when I'm interviewing them, asking about what their training background is. What did this organization do to provide you the skills that you needed to do your job? Were you trained to be a supervisor before they put you in the job of a supervisor? We all know what the answer to that is. They don't do it.
No.
Right? They're unicorns, those organizations where that is done. And so, yeah, I will go on and on about that.
No, absolutely. I think I certainly have become much more aware the longer I do investigation work of how much the people who are put into supervisory and managerial roles want to be doing better. They wish they had the training access to be able to be doing these things. And in part because it's uncomfortable for them to be having hard conversations with people or receiving emotional feedback or complaints from their staff and not really knowing how to handle it well. And you're right. We have a really interesting process question, unless Jody, I think Jody might be frozen. Sorry. Oh, no, you're not. You were just thinking.
I'm not. I'm just thinking and reading the questions. Yeah.
I was gonna say, we had a really interesting question here that's more a process question that I'd love to hear from you guys on. Why is the complainant not allowed to see the investigation report? How do they know whether the investigator understood the information provided and it was interpreted properly?
Well, I mean, I don't know why I'm jumping in first on this, but it's none of I don't mean to be glib about this, but that's none of my business. My client is the organization. I do an investigation. I provide a comprehensive report and maybe recommendations separate from that or a part of that, and that goes to the organization. It's up to them what they do with that.
You mean it's up to them if they allow the complainant to read it or not?
Yeah, I've seen a wide variety of responses from organizations to how they deal with that from government, which would be super risk averse.
Yeah.
Properly so, and to other small organizations that are really share-ish or whatever, without compromising confidentiality, and probably sometimes sharing too much. But
yeah, and I think I don't have the official answer, but maybe something about confidentiality, because if we have to put information there about other witnesses or about information we were told, then that may be part of the answer. So then we're divulging information to anyway, multiple. But
when they ask me, I tell them to call Jody, call a lawyer, consult with your legal counsel on that for
yeah,
sure.
and there are ways to get.
Yeah.
So that's what I was going to say. That's the I write the report as if it's going to be made actually public. In terms of now, it might have to be redacted, but I kind of write it expecting that the parties will see it. And it is, like Barry says, it's in the policy of whatever policy the organization follows. They usually have made the determination of whether it's provided or a summary is provided or a combination. And then I tell parties as well that that are participating that some of it's confidential unless it's required by law or the process to have it. I believe in government that if it's if an employee grieves as part of a union and grieves the report or grieves the findings or grieves the discipline as a result of, that they can access the reports through the grievance process.
Yeah, I think if it goes at least up to arbitration. I don't know if it's before arbitration, but at least at arbitration.
The labor board. So there is a way there, but yeah, so I just try to write it in case
Yeah.
You know, so and because we're not really, we're not supposed to put commentary. We're not supposed to really put, you know, I just think that you just kind of stick with your,
Mhm.
these are the facts. These are what you were told. This is your credibility based on these
Mhm.
factors. And,
Yeah, we're
so,
not providing color commentary in our reports. I mean, the reports can be really long and excruciatingly detailed, but they're about here's what, you know, here's who told me what, here's what the parties, that's the complainant, the respondent told me. You know, based on a balance of probabilities, you know, based on the credibility assessment, here's what I believe is the accurate picture of what happened. Here's whether or not that meets the definition of harassment, abuse of authority, poison work environment. But my understanding of the reason that the complainant is typically not allowed, and it's common for a complainant or a respondent not to be allowed to read the report. My understanding is it's because we have to name who the witnesses are, and at times those witnesses are quoted, right? We have to say, this witness told me these things. And so in order to, I think it's an attempt to really protect the confidentiality of that, also to protect from retaliation. That being said, I agree with Barry. Different organizations do it in different ways. I like to know in advance. It's always really important to me when I'm meeting any witness,
yeah.
whether I'm talking to the complainant or the respondent or a witness, I want them to know who's going to have access to their information when I'm done with it. So I always want to be able to tell them this report is going to this level of management or this level of HR. The complainant and the respondent will not read it, or they will get a copy of it, or whatever it is in that organization, because I want each individual who's speaking to me to make a choice, their own informed decision about what they share with me, knowing that information. Really interesting. Someone says that they called SMB about what Jody was saying earlier. They called SMB recently, and the pre-recorded message reminded people that the SMB employees are protected by the GNB Respectful Workplace Policy. I'm really pleased to hear that. I'm pretty familiar with that one, so I'm really pleased to hear it's getting referenced in these phone messages.
Good.
Yeah.
The issue about, so I was just going to say the issue about making recommendations on discipline. Personally, I don't believe that that's the role of an investigator is to make recommendations on discipline. I suppose if we're requested to have that input, we, you know, we doesn't stop us from providing it if the client wants it, and then if it is, it's never part of the investigation report. And I suppose it maybe is different, Nicole, from a workplace assessment, that may be part of the contract is to do an assessment and then make recommendations. But that you'd want that to be clear at the beginning is who makes the determination of discipline. Typically, I don't make just recommendations of discipline personally because it's an HR experience thing that I you know, I'm not as involved in, but I think you're mixing two things up. First, it's the finding, and then based on you know, based on the place of employment, what's their discipline options.
I agree with that. I don't. So when Jody references a workplace assessment is another piece of work that sometimes practitioners like us will do. I do them where you go in and you interview everybody. There's been kind of a workplace that's been messy, that's had a lot of conflict, that has that sort of everyone on eggshells kind of feeling. And they'll get someone like me to come in and interview everybody and to say, here's what I'm hearing from your staff about what's going on. Here's where I think, filtering all that information through my own sort of years in this field, what I think is causing the most conflict or tension with your staff. What are the primary points of conflict or tension? And here are recommendations to start turning this ship around, because there's no magic wand, but how do we start moving the momentum towards positive workplace atmosphere instead of where it is now? Even in those recommendations, if I'm making recommendations, because not every every employer wants you to make recommendations after an investigation, but if I am asked to do it, I also don't think it's my role to say what kind of discipline I think needs to happen. I will say something like, if it's an investigation and there's been founded, you know, say 7 out of 9 allegations were determined to be founded, I might write something like 7 out of 9 allegations were determined to be founded. If the employer accepts this determination, performance manage accordingly. because to me, that's really up to them. They have their own HR policy. They have their own HR people. We might be in a nonprofit where they maybe have an a labor lawyer they go to sometimes, or maybe their executive director does HR off the side of their desk, or we might be dealing with someone who's a huge organization, who has a huge, yes, and a union, who has a huge HR department and a union that they need to deal with. So I agree, even if I'm writing a workplace assessment where there's a lot more space for me to kind of make recommendations more so than with just an investigation, I always say, if, here's what I'm hearing from your employees that this person has done that's misconduct. I haven't verified that because it's an assessment, not an investigation. Verify it. If it turns out to be true, performance manage accordingly. Because again, I feel like that's not my place. I'm just looking through we've got about 8 minutes left. If anybody wants to throw some more questions into us.
I wanted to say something about, again, on the prevention side of things, and I think we've mentioned, competency-based performance management. If organizations aren't doing that, and in particular with smaller organizations, but sometimes in larger sections of maybe a government department or whatever, the level of dysfunction that I've seen in some of these places is shocking. And there is really good and hopeful language in the respectful workplace policy and GAB's policy about the role of management, and I don't, I don't like it when I don't know that we're seeing managers and CEOs being held by CEOs, whatever, ADMs, deputies, being held to account for the lack of training that they're allowing to exist in departments. And by all means, this is not a wide brush across government. Amazing HR professionals who are doing a great job every day. Lots of people really care, but these are hard to deal with. And there are so many people who are left to their own devices to sort through these cases. And that's hard to see. You can't help but feel bad for these people coming out of these investigations. But, robust change doesn't happen until people, decision makers are really feeling it, right?
Mm.
And Barry touched on it, and it's one of your comments in the questions that even as a witness to an investigation, it impacts the morale. It's stressful. It's hard on everybody. As a witness, they never have any idea of the outcome of an investigation.
Mhm.
And sometimes the complainant may not know exactly what. And it's like sometimes you'll hear about bullying at school. Well, we dealt with it, but we can't tell
Yeah.
one parent what we did with the other child because it's private and confidential about whether they went to counseling or whether they went to wherever. And so it's hard because you want to say we're dealing with it, but yet the people, the employees and the complainants need to know that they are dealing with it, and you never really know if they're dealing with it. It's like your parents and you're telling your children, one of them, like you're saying, okay, just
Yeah.
leave it with me.
Mhm.
We're dealing with it, but they don't really necessarily see the change in behavior.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
it's hard. And that's why too, you try to contain it as best as you can.
Yeah.
And then there's a comment there too, Nicole, sorry for doing it, but
No, go
doing your
ahead.
job.
You
But
do
there's a
her.
comment about, if I overhear other employees, but the manager's not right there, it does go back to first principles of what's in your policy. Do you have kind of environments where you can discuss in general about what's expected and what's not expected in the workplace? And if that's not clear, then it does start. Often there are no policies, or it's an old
Mhm.
policy.
Yeah.
And so I guess we're a bit nerdy around what's the policy state. If there's no policy, you go to, the legislation. But, and who do you go to and how do you have friendly conversations? And
Yeah, and
I
these supervisors don't understand that they have an absolute obligation to intervene in front of a group of people for certain things, like the reference
Yeah.
to the comment that's inappropriate in front of 10 people. the supervisor has to intervene right there. I'm sorry, not my intention to embarrass you. We don't talk like that in the workplace here anymore. Because if you take that offline and only talk to them offline, then you have to go individually and meet with every single one of those people so that they know that you're addressing, you know, with everyone, but it needs to be addressed at the time, which will be embarrassing. But but they were the person that made totally inappropriate story about the college days or whatever. We don't do that in the workplace anymore.
Well, and yeah, we have a comment here, someone asking about how do employees handle when another employee is making discriminatory comments, right? Or I think there's a role of a supervisor there. I think there's a certain role as a coworker, how to handle that. Absolutely. A bit of a bystander intervention. Absolutely. I think you are within your rights as a coworker to be like, hey, I'm not comfortable with that comment, even if you might be the only one. Maybe you know everyone else in the room isn't either, and you're the only one who feels like you can stand up to it in the moment. But I think it speaks to often, it's funny, Jody saying about how we're kind of nerdy about this stuff. I think everyone who does this work we get really excited about policy and about process and about conflict management as a whole. I think none of us would be sad if everyone addressed, none of the three of us, I think at all, would be sad if everyone addressed their conflicts in work early and we didn't have to do any more harassment investigations. I mean, I love doing them. I picked this work, but if everyone was happy and they addressed everything healthy and early, I'd be happy for them to put me out of a job. I think we all would.
Yeah, and I try to assure employers as a green flag. Like, I don't want to belabor this file. I'm not making my career off of your back on this one file. It's good work, be thorough, in and out, and on to the next.
Absolutely. None of us want to make it worse.
Hopefully, yes, and hopefully not many more next, but
yes.
I see our facilitator has a moderator has come on, so I better.
I hate for my face to be the signal that conversation has to end. We are getting close to the end of our day. Thank you, Nicole, Jody, and Barry. This has been a really, really interesting conversation. This whole world is very opaque from the outside. Things like harassment investigations, until you're in a position where you're involved with one as a witness or as a complainant, or as a defendant, or as a manager, or as HR, it's really hard to know exactly what to expect and how it's going to work. So this has been really, really illuminating, and it's great to hear you guys talk about this area you're clearly also skilled in. Since we're wrapping up the day, I also wanted to say a thank you to all of our presenters for today. We've had a bunch of great sessions today, and thank you to the audience for sticking with us for the full day. This concludes the first day of Respectful Workplace Week Forum. I want to make two short announcements before we go. First, beginning at 3 p.m. in 5 minutes, we invite you all to join us for a hands-on, skill-based workshop about what to do if someone in your workplace may be experiencing violence at home. This can be vitally important for their safety planning. It's the It's Your Business DIPV in the Workplace Toolkit Workshop. We dropped the registration link in chat at the start of today. Amber's going to put it back in chat again right now. You can still get the link. It's not too late. Just flip over and register there and you'll get it right away. That's starting in 5 minutes. And if you aren't already signed up for it, just a reminder that we also have the Safer Places workplace sexual harassment training for employees that's taking place Friday at 10 a.m. It's free. You can have your whole team sign up for it if you want. There's no cap on how many people. It's being facilitated by a member of my staff, and it's going to be great. It's a great free opportunity to get some of your staff get their heads wrapped around, sort of the rules around workplace sexual harassment and what to do if it's coming up in your workplace. So you don't have to hire any of these nice people anytime down the road. Otherwise, please join us back again tomorrow. We'll be starting at 10 a.m. as well. We're going to be discussing topics like pay equity, understanding accessibility, the duty to accommodate at work, and wrapping up with a conversation about the decent work agenda for the nonprofit sector. I hope we'll see you back again at 10 a.m. tomorrow, and everybody have a really great evening. Thank you so much. Take care.